Smoke still clung to the wool of Archer Blackwood's jacket when his hand found Joe's elbow and pulled her backward into the shadow of the service corridor. The distant crack of a second gunshot still rang in her ears. Her back met the cold plaster wall. Archer stood in front of her, blocking the narrow sliver of light from the far doorway, one arm braced beside her head. Her nursing instincts fired before her fear did. Her fingers went for the side of his neck. Pulse check, blood check, and his hand came up and caught her wrist at his jaw, holding it there. The scarred side of his face was 2 inches from hers. The ruined landscape of it, the pulled skin, the pale seam running from temple to chin, was something she had stopped flinching at somewhere in the last 3 weeks. In this light it looked like something carved from granite. "I'm still standing, Josephine." His voice was barely above a murmur, dark and completely composed. "Did you think a scar could put me down?" She had no answer, not yet. She didn't have one yet. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a different person entirely. Josephine Kline, Jo, to everyone who mattered, was 26 years old, 11 credits away from her Bachelor of Science in nursing, and the kind of tired that a second cup of coffee couldn't touch. She worked nights at Massachusetts General, drove a 9-year-old Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and kept a running list in the back of her planner of things she was going to do once she finally finished her degree. None of those things involved the name Blackwood. Her brother Devin had made that decision for her. Devin was 30 and reckless the way some men are reckless. Not dramatically, not all at once, but through a long series of small stupid choices that accumulated the way credit card debt did, invisibly until it wasn't invisible anymore. Cards, loans, wrong rooms, wrong company. Jo had bailed him out twice with her own savings, and once with a lie she'd told their mother. She didn't know he had gone to the Blackwood Syndicate until the envelope arrived at her apartment, hand-delivered, no return address. Inside was a single page of figures, $312,000. The name at the bottom was not Devin's, it was hers. Countersigned without her knowledge on a guarantee form, her signature forged in ink that looked almost right if you didn't know what her actual handwriting looked like. Devin had skipped town 2 days before the envelope arrived. The number on the burner phone inside the envelope connected to a man named Boone, who told her, in a voice like gravel shifting, that she had 48 hours to present herself at an address in the South End, or the matter would be pursued through other channels. He did not explain what other channels meant. Jo was tired enough and angry enough at her brother that she almost didn't ask. She showed up. The building on Melrose Street looked like a converted textile warehouse from the outside. Exposed brick, steel-framed windows, the kind of renovation that cost more than most people made in a decade. Boone met her in the lobby. He was built like something load-bearing, wore a dark suit without a tie, and had the professionally neutral expression of a man who had been unreadable by choice for years. He looked her over. The scrub jacket with the Mass General logo still on it, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she was gripping her tote bag, and his expression didn't shift. He led her upstairs, down a hallway lined with original oil paintings, tiny authentication plaques beside each frame, and through a set of frosted glass doors into an office that occupied the entire south corner of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a desk of pale ash wood running nearly the length of one wall, books, a bar cart with bottles she didn't recognize by label. Everything's expensive, nothing ostentatious. Archer Blackwood was standing at the window with his back to her when she walked in. She had heard the name before. Everyone who spent time in certain parts of Boston had. He ran the Blackwood Syndicate. What that actually consisted of, Jo understood only in the way civilians understood things. Real estate, shipping, some arrangement with the Port Authority that newspapers described very carefully and without specifics. The things that didn't make the papers were, by most accounts, worse. He turned around when he heard her. She had prepared herself. She knew about the attack 14 months ago outside his office building in the financial district. A man in a passing car. an acid compound through the open window of his SUV before anyone could react. 3 seconds of contact before the medics arrived. She had treated a burn patient at Mass General once with similar-sounding injuries. She understood what it looked like in recovery. She thought she was ready. She was not entirely ready. The left side of Archer Blackwood's face bore the evidence of what had been done to him. The scar ran from temple to jaw, not raw anymore, but settled into the pale, taut permanence that came after months of grafting and time. His left hand, where it hung at his side, was similarly marked, the fingers not quite curved the way a hand rested. Naturally, the tendon damage from the same incident, written into the slight stiffness of his grip. He was tall, dark-haired, going grey at the temples. His eyes, both of them, undamaged, were the specific blue-grey of the Atlantic in late October, and they moved over her with the slow, exact attention of a man who never looked at anything carelessly. He crossed the room and sat down at his desk without hurrying. "Josephine Kline," he said. It wasn't a question. "Joe," she said, "and before you say whatever you're about to say, Devin forged my signature. I can prove it. I have 3 years of handwriting samples and a document examiner I can call by tomorrow morning who will—" "I know he forged it," Archer said. "Sit down." She sat. "Your brother," he continued, opening a folder on his desk, "signed a guarantee in your name because he believed I would not pursue a nursing student." He closed the folder. "He was wrong, however. I am not unreasonable. I don't want your loan payments." He leaned back slightly. "I want something more practical." He explained it efficiently. The acid attack had left damage that people in his world had spent 14 months reading as weakness. His enemies watched the scars. They watched the stiffness in his left hand. They had begun testing, in small ways, and small tests had a habit of growing into larger ones. What he needed was someone visible enough at his side to shift the optics. Not a cripple being managed, but a man who had absorbed something devastating and continued. A companion, a presence. In exchange, Devin's debt would be cleared. She would want for nothing during the duration of the arrangement. Joe stared at him across the pale ash desk. "You want me to stand next to you," she said, "so your enemies stop reading your face as a liability." "I want you present," he said. "What you choose to do with that presence is your own business." She thought about Devin, wherever he was. She thought about the $312,000. She thought about the NCLEX exam fee she had pushed back twice because she couldn't cover it. "How long?" she asked. 3 months, he said, possibly less. She said yes. She would tell herself later that she'd had no real choice. She understood later that this wasn't entirely honest. She moved into the guest suite of his Beacon Hill townhouse on a Sunday evening. It was the nicest room she had ever slept in. She had a hard time sleeping in it for the first several nights. She learned the rhythm of his days in the first 2 weeks. At his desk by 6 in the morning, calls through noon, solitary lunch, afternoons in meetings she wasn't present for. Physical therapy twice a week, a therapist who came to the 3rd floor, and Joe heard it sometimes through the closed door, the instruction, the controlled effort, the work of forcing a hand to comply that didn't want to. She never mentioned she could hear it. He never asked her to pretend she couldn't. She started cooking occasionally, because the housekeeper came 3 days a week, and she needed something to do with her hands in the evenings. She left food on the kitchen counter without ceremony. He ate it without comment. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was something close enough to proximity that the difference was hard to name. She began to understand the actual shape of his situation on the afternoon that Shepherd Nix came to the house. Nix was Archer's second-in-command, a slim man in his early 40s who wore his suits well and had the specific kind of charm that made the back of Joe's neck prickle. Something about the way his smile arrived before the warmth behind it did. He moved through the townhouse as though he owned it, dropping into the chair across from Archer's desk, without waiting for an invitation. Joe had been organizing correspondence on the hallway table, close enough to the study door that she could hear, without having intended to position herself that way. Slate is making noise about the Harbor Point contract, Nick said. Theron Slate, the head of a Providence operation whose reach had been quietly extending north for the better part of 2 years. He's got 2 of our dock supervisors on payroll. We should move before this becomes structural. We're not moving on Slate, Archer said. He's pushing to see if we blink. We don't. I want the Harbor Point invoices audited by Thursday. A brief silence. Nick's voice shifted, lowered, slowed slightly, the way something being carefully loaded shifts in weight. Archer. He paused. The men are talking. They see you at the desk. They don't see you in the field. They see the situation and they start asking questions about who's actually running the day-to-day. It might be time to let me take the Harbor Point piece directly. Show some presence. Given, another heartbeat. Given how things look right now. The air in the room changed in a way Joe felt from the hallway. Say the rest of it, Archer said quietly. Nick sat back. I'm saying that optics matter. What the men see when they look at you is not inspiring confidence. You're not in any condition to. Get out of my house, Shepard. No volume, no heat, the flattest, most controlled sentence Joe had ever heard spoken. Nick's left. In the hallway, he paused beside the table where Joe stood and looked at her with the long, weighing look of someone taking an inventory they intended to use later. Then he walked out. Joe stepped into the study. Archer was at the window, his back to her, his good hand braced on the sill. His left hand hung at his side. She could see the tension across his shoulders. She didn't reach for anything soft. The audit, she said, keeping her voice level. Do you want me to coordinate the document request with Boone, or does that go through you directly? He turned and looked at her, a look that recalibrated something. Through Boone, he said. I'll call him this afternoon, she said, and went back to the hallway table. She had been shaking slightly. She didn't know exactly when that had started. The Alderton benefit was held on a Friday evening at the top floor of a Seaport District tower, the kind of event where the city's most powerful people performed generosity at $2,000 a plate in rooms lit to make everyone look slightly better than they were. Archer attended annually, this year, with Joe beside him in a midnight blue gown that his assistant had selected and that she was still deciding whether to forgive anyone for. The room's attention was immediate. She had learned to read rooms during her clinical rotations, emotional temperature, the geography of alliances. She felt every pair of eyes in that ballroom track toward Archer as they stepped off the private elevator, felt them move to his face and then slide carefully away, and she felt him register it, in the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. She put her hand on his arm. Not for show, or not only for show. He looked down at her hand, then back up. Something in his face shifted. Theron Slate found them at the bar 20 minutes later. He was older than Joe had expected from the way his name was spoken. Mid-60s, silver-haired, carrying the ease of a man who had been powerful long enough that power had become automatic. His smile did not reach his eyes by quite a few inches. Archer, Slate said. I wasn't sure you'd make it this year. His gaze moved over Archer's face with the careful deliberateness of someone taking a measurement. You're looking resilient. She felt Archer's arm go slightly rigid under her hand. Before he could respond, Joe turned to Slate with the particular pleasant neutrality she used with difficult family members on her floor, the tone that communicated warmth and absolute refusal at the same time. Mr. Slate, she said, I've been reading about your interest in the Harbor Point contract. It must be genuinely frustrating, the preparation that goes into a bid like that. And then the invoicing irregularities at your Providence operations surfacing at exactly the wrong moment. She let the last sentence sit in the air between them, quiet as a thing put down carefully. Logistics is such a detail-oriented business. Slate's smile went rigid. I don't believe we've met, he said. Joe Kline, she said pleasantly. Archer's. She left the rest of that sentence to do its own work. Archer looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something startled and dark, and flickering toward something she might have called amusement if she'd had time to think about it. Slate excused himself. He wasn't graceful about it. "You read the Harbor Point files," Archer said quietly. "Boone mentioned the invoicing irregularities when we coordinated the audit request last week," she said. "I pay attention." He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they have fundamentally misidentified, and are now in the process of reconsidering. Then every light in the room went out at once. The first shot came through the north-facing glass before Joe's brain had caught up to the darkness. A single tremendous crack that exploded the floor-to-ceiling pane and sent a sound like the end of something through the entire room. Then 2 more shots from below the roofline. Screams erupted. The crowd lurched in every direction, glass on the floor. Joe felt Archer's hand close on her waist in the pitch dark, certain, immediate, unerring, and pull her down and lateral, away from the window line, moving before she'd consciously decided to move. "Service corridor," he said against her ear. "Now." She had already kicked her heels off. They moved through the bar entrance, through the staff door behind it, into the service corridor, a narrow, dimly lit passage that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and the carpet from the floor below, bare feet on cold tile. Joe's hand in Archer's right hand, his grip exact and steady, navigating by memory and the thin emergency strip lighting near the baseboards. They stopped in a section of corridor between 2 supply rooms, backs against the wall, while somewhere behind them the building's alarm began, and voices multiplied in the ballroom. Archer was checking the corridor in both directions. His breathing was level. Joe's was not. Her hands found the side of his neck without permission, the left side, the side where the nerve damage ran down to his shoulder, where he might not register a graze wound. His hand came up and caught her wrist. He held it there against the scarred skin at his jaw and turned to look at her. "I'm still standing, Josephine." His voice was low and entirely composed, a dark thread of sound through the ringing in her ears. "Did you think a scar could put me down?" She looked at him, at the controlled steadiness in his face 2 inches from hers, at the quality of his stillness while the world came apart on the other side of the wall, and she had no answer for what she was feeling. Not fear, exactly. Something larger than fear and harder to name. "No," she said. "I'm starting to think that would be very difficult." Something moved at the edge of his mouth. Then he was moving again, pulling her toward the stairwell. They went down 4 flights and out through a fire door into the parking structure below the building. Boone materialized from behind a concrete pillar with 2 men and a black SUV positioned there in advance, and Joe understood. Archer had expected something. He had prepared for it. He had let it happen, because he needed confirmation of something he already suspected. In the back of the SUV, Joe ran her fingers along the scar tissue of his left hand without asking permission, checking for heat, for swelling, for the specific signs of a contact wound he might not be able to feel. His hand was large and still in both of hers. He watched her examine it the way he watched everything, with that absolute unhurried attention. "No wound," she said. She didn't immediately let go. He didn't pull away. "Nix set the window," Archer said quietly. "He gave them our arrival time and our position in the room." Joe went still. "You already knew," she said. "At the house 2 weeks ago, you knew then." "I suspected. I needed him to act to confirm it." He looked out the window at the city passing in the rain. "The audit you coordinated with Boone is what proved it. Nix has been moving money to Slate's operation for 11 months. He arranged the acid attack 14 months ago. He has been waiting for me to be weak enough to take." Joe thought about Nix in the hallway, the way he had looked at her, the inventory in his eyes. Where is he now? "Being located," Archer said. They did not go back to Beacon Hill. Boone drove them to a property in Charlestown, an unremarkable building from the outside, reinforced to a degree that revised Joe's estimate of how seriously Archer took his own security. Inside, it ran like a military operation. Monitors, maps, a dozen men who moved with the compressed efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this. Jo stayed. No one asked her to. No one suggested she leave. She stayed because leaving felt in some specific way she couldn't entirely articulate, like the wrong thing to do. She watched Archer work, seated at a steel table, phone in his right hand, voice flat and precise. He directed the response to the night's attack with the methodical calm of a man disassembling a machine he had built himself. She had heard his name for years and thought she knew the shape of what it meant. Watching him in that room, she understood something more specific. That his power wasn't located in what he owned or who answered to him. It lived in the quality of his thinking, the absolute absence of panic, the way he held a dozen variables simultaneously and made decisions without visible deliberation, his left hand resting on the table, imperfectly cooperative and entirely beside the point. She brought him coffee. She sat across from him and listened without pretending she wasn't. He didn't ask her to leave. At 2 a.m, Boone's phone rang. He listened, said 3 words, and looked at Archer. "They found Nix," Boone said. "Slate property in Quincy, 30-odd men with him. He's saying he's taking the family." The room went quiet. Archer sat for a moment perfectly still. Then he pushed back from the table and stood. "Tell him I'm coming alone," he said. Jo's chair was already scraping back. She was on her feet with her hand on his arm before she'd consciously decided to speak. "Listen to me." She stopped herself and started over. "Archer, 30 men, a Slate property, and a man who already tried to kill you once. That is not a conversation. That is an ambush." He looked at her for a moment. Under the fluorescent lights of the Charlestown building, the scar on his face was starkly visible. He did not look diminished by it. He looked like something that had been tested and had not broken. Worn down to its essential structure, which turned out to be considerably harder than what had been done to the surface. "I know," he said. "Then don't." "Josephine." He said her full name the way he always did, not unkindly, but with a completeness to it, as if the name itself carried weight. He touched the side of her face, one brief contact, the backs of his scarred fingers against her cheek, gone before she could process it. "I know exactly what I'm walking into." She stared at him. "The men Nix believes he bought," Archer said quietly, "were never his. I've known about his arrangement with Slate since March. I let him run because I needed to know the full extent of it before I moved." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "There are 30 men in that warehouse in Quincy, and 28 of them are mine." Jo absorbed this. "Then why go alone?" "Because a king does not send his people to deal with a traitor," he said simply. "He does it himself." She held his gaze for a moment. "Then I'm going with you." He looked at her with an expression that had genuine surprise in it, underneath everything else. "No," he said. "I'm not going to the—" "You're staying here with Boone," he said. "Not as protection, as a witness." He paused. Someone who knows the full truth of how it happened. I want that person to be you." She didn't entirely understand what he meant. She understood it later. He kissed her once before he left. Brief, unannounced, the kind of thing that happened not as a performance but as a fact, and then he was gone out the door and into the rain. Jo was not in the room when Archer walked into the Quincy warehouse alone. She was not there when Shepherd Nix raised his gun, and the firing pin struck an empty chamber, and then again, and the sound of it was the only sound in a building full of men who had already chosen their loyalty. She pieced it together from Boone's clipped account and from the specific quality of silence that preceded the call, confirming it was over. When the SUV pulled back into the Charlestown lot an hour later, Jo was standing at the building's steel door. She had run through, in the preceding hour, several clinical scenarios involving trauma management and emergency transport, and things she had no ability to prevent. She had prepared herself for a range of outcomes. She had not quite prepared for the specific way her chest loosened when the door opened, and Archer stepped out, unhurt, moving under his own power, his coat dark with rain, his face entirely composed. He walked toward her. She met him halfway. "Nix," she said. "Concluded," he said. Slate lost his entire Harbor Point operation tonight. He'll spend the next 2 years rebuilding and won't come north again. She looked at him, at the rain on his shoulders, the steadiness of his breathing, and something accumulated in her chest. The last 3 weeks, the last several hours, the hour she had just spent in a room in Charlestown, telling herself she was not afraid. She put her hand flat against his chest, old habit, new instinct, or something that lived between the two. His heart was beating, steady and slow. His hand came up and covered hers, holding it there against his sternum. "You stayed," he said. "I told you I wasn't going to the East Room," she said. Something shifted in his face, a slow release of something long held in place. He brought his scarred hand up and turned her face toward his. "You walked into my office 8 weeks ago to negotiate a debt that wasn't yours," he said. "You learned the audit files. You stood up to Theron Slate, using information you had quietly gathered because it seemed relevant. You stayed in a Charlestown warehouse at 2 in the morning with men you'd known for 3 weeks because leaving felt wrong to you." He paused. "I want you to know that I have been watching all of that." Joe held his gaze. "You're making it sound more deliberate than it was." "I'm describing what I observed," he said. "Those are different things." The rain came down around them, steady and cold, and neither of them moved. "You told me," she said, "when we first met, that you needed someone visible at your side because people were reading your scars as weakness." "Yes. I want to say something about that." She kept her hand on his chest. "In the last 3 weeks I have watched you run an operation that most people couldn't manage with both hands working perfectly. I have watched you outthink 2 different enemies simultaneously and set a trap that worked exactly the way you planned it 14 months in advance." She looked up at him directly. "Anyone who looked at your face and decided you were diminished was not paying attention to the right things." The thing that moved across his expression then was something she hadn't seen in him before. Something that didn't need a name because it was already understood between them. He kissed her in the rain outside the Charlestown building, with Boone a deliberate 20 feet away, and it was nothing like performance. It was a real thing, the kind that happened when 2 people had been holding something carefully at a distance long enough that when it finally closed the gap, it did so entirely. When they separated, she kept her hand where it was. "The 3 months," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think," Joe said, "those terms are going to need to be renegotiated." Archer looked at her for a long moment. A small, specific curve came to the undamaged side of his mouth, and then, slowly, to the other side as well. "I think you're right," he said. The world had spent 14 months looking at the surface of what had been done to Archer Blackwood and deciding what it meant about him. They had seen the damage and stopped there. They had watched him from a careful distance and concluded that what they were seeing was the end of something. They had not been watching his hands. They had not been watching the quality of his stillness, or the precision of his patience, or the way he played a long game so quietly that the people moving against him never realized they were already inside it. Josephine Kline had watched all of it, and she was not afraid of what she found there. She had, in fact, decided, somewhere between the service corridor and the rain-soaked parking lot of a building in Charlestown, that she wanted to stay and keep watching. Theron Slate was still out there, licking his losses, and the world Archer moved through was not a forgiving one. She knew that. She had known it from the moment she walked through the door on Melrose Street. She kept her hand against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady in the dark, and thought, that is enough. That is exactly enough to start.